Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Irv. Much like Irv, this is my second demography meeting that I've been up here as well. But wanted to tell a quick story about the first presentation that I ever gave as part of the demography office, and that was up in Jamestown, which is just outside of Boulder, and they had been hit really heavily by the floods back in September of 2013, and went up there just kind of give them a little bit of an economic overview of what they had, and that was a very small economic overview, trust me. It's not a very big town, not very many businesses that are there, but we were sitting there, one of my other colleagues and I, and in front of the mayor and the town board, and I started my presentation. I had a bar chart on there, and one of the town council members said, "Yes, bar charts." And I said, whew, I was kind of scared at first there. And he said, "Oh, man, I love bar charts. I hope you have line charts, too, and other things." I said, "Well, you're really going to be happy today, because I got that. I might even have a pie chart there. And in my presentation later, I got thematic maps as well, too. So we've got a lot of that. So hopefully you're a lot like that guy and are going to be very excited by that." I can tell already looking around the room, we have some data nerd stickers that we put out on the tables, and some people have already embraced it and put those on, so it makes me feel like I'm in a good audience here, so you're going to be able to really like a lot of the data that I have. But first, I'll have a few slides that kind of cover what we're going to be talking about today overall. So I'm going to start with a global economic outlook, and then we'll go into the U.S. economic overview, and we are seeing slower growth across the United States. And that's something that's very key because Colorado is intrinsically tied to the United States growth and to a certain lesser extent the world's growth as well. So it's really important to see how the U.S. is doing because that's going to really be tied to our fortunes there too. I'm going to look back and see how we did in 2015 in Colorado. 2015 was a really good year. 2014 was just great. 2015 just a little bit less strength than what we saw in 14. 16, where we stand right now, I'll give you an update, and then I'll get into our forecast, tell you what we think is going to happen over the next quarter of century going forward across our state, and also spend a little bit more time looking into our counties. After all, we are the Department of Local Affairs. We look at all the different counties. We are excited that a number of you, as Elizabeth said, 14% came from outside the metro area, so hopefully I'll touch on your county if you came all this way, and if not, catch me afterwards, and we can talk a little bit more about your county as well. If you look at what the global headlines were saying about the economy right before the IMF, International Monetary Fund, released their mid-year update in October, they didn't sound too positive. The title of the IMF's report was Subdued Demand. From Econ 101, we know that subdued demand is not something we really want to see. We want to see the demand curve shift out, in which case we'll have to have more supply, we'll have a growing economy overall. 5 years of economic disappointments. I'll show you that on one of the next slides, of just how we've kind of seen slower world GDP growth over the past 5 years, but hopefully that's going to be in line to change here very soon. The IMF also talked about one line that said the still weak and precarious nature of the global recovery, which is concerning that we are now well into this recovery and it still feels weak and a little bit precarious. Slow growth is something that we've seen across the globe, and one of the things that we've also seen is a populist pushback. I think this is evident in the Republican Party nominee for president. We've seen it happening over in Europe in Brexit, which happened over the summer, and we've also seen a lot of other ultra-nationalist parties that have been rising in the polls throughout Europe as well. So that's just a reflection of that populism that we're seeing. Financial Times had a little bit more of a harsh review of what the IMF report said, where they said the global economic growth is sliding back into the morass, which is a boggy or swampy ground. So it's not something you want to be sliding into necessarily there. And then lastly, I really like this kind of headline from a couple of Brookings Institute economists that said we are in a low-growth environment characterized by weak investment. And this weak investment has largely been capital expenditures on non-building, so we're talking a lot of our oil and gas drilling that we're seeing here. Stagnant productivity. This is a big concern of a lot of economists. We've seen 3 consecutive quarters with declining productivity growth, and that's not something that we want to see. That can be tied to our wage growth too, kind of hamper that. And really tepid private sector confidence. If we look at some of the consumer confidence reports, they are rising, which is good, but they're still below the levels where we were in 2000 and 2006. 2007 at the end of our last expansions that we have. So hopefully we'll continue to see confidence continue to rise. Investment should kind of work through and improve a little bit, and that productivity is kind of a question mark, but we'll see what happens going forward. So if you were to just go by those headlines, you would think that where we're talking is about 2009, and we're looking at that sharp downward trajectory on our global and U.S. economy and our outlook. Fortunately, we're nowhere near that. In fact, what we're looking at is the global growth did slow a little bit in 2016, slowed down to 3.2%. First half of the year, that's an estimate still, first half of the year did come in at a disappointing 2.9%, but we are anticipating that it's going to tick up a little bit faster in 2017, with growth growing to about 3.4% globally. And one of the reasons for this faster growth in 2017 is the U.S. is picking up a little bit of momentum as well. Our U.S. GDP is shown on the blue line, and I have the forecast dashed. We can see that that is going to uptick a little bit, going up above 2% again, which is a good thing for our output that we are producing here in the United States. And the world output is going to go up too. In fact, from 3.4% and going up actually closer to 4% by the time this forecast period ends in 2020. One of the reasons why we are seeing better global growth is really we're finally seeing the emerging markets and developing economies picking up some steam again. If we look, there have been a couple of emerging markets or developing economies that have really been mired in deep recessions. If we look at Brazil and Russia, for examples there, some of them are tied to commodities and oil, but as oil has kind of seemed to find a bottom recently and seeing some rising energy prices, they're benefiting as well. And they're also adjusting to some of their weaker currencies that they're having in those lower capital inflows. But going forward, we do see the global economy, or IMF sees it rather, growing from about 4.2% this year up to 4.6% and gradually growing up to 5% by the end of this forecast period. This is not a thematic map that I made, but if you look at it, the countries that are in the dark kind of brown, those are the ones that are expected to be growing the fastest. You'll notice India is on there, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is on there as well, and a lot of the non-Asian, non-OECD organized, economically developed countries in Asia are those ones that are also in dark brown. And one of the reasons why it's important for us to have global growth above 3% is that increases the global demand for oil, which will help push up the price, which will help a lot of our energy explorers here and a lot of the commodity-dependent countries as well. Now, if we look more at the advanced economies, and these are all the ones that you see up there right now that are highlighted, as namely the U.S., Canada, Australia, most of Europe there as well, the growth is much slower. In fact, we see growth below 2% over this forecast period, with it averaging about 1.7%. And some of that is due to Brexit and some slower growth in Britain and some of their neighbors. And it's also due to aging populations that we're seeing across much of Europe and in the United States too. And that's going to be something that's going to slow down our growth potential going forward, as I'll share with you a little bit later on in the presentation as well. So earlier I showed the U.S. GDP. That was below the world GDP for most of that chart. It was interesting. If we did go back 20 years, back in 1997, I'll flash back to it real quickly for you. 97, 98, less than 20 years ago, the U.S. led the world economy there. Now, part of it was there was an Asian kind of financial crisis that was happening, so that kind of pulled it down. But the U.S. was the global leader not but 20 years ago in growth, and now we're growing by about 3 percentage points less than what the globe is growing by, as the emerging markets and emerging world economies are making up a bigger share of our global economy and growing a lot faster. But overall, if we look, our GDP growth has been subdued. It has been below 2.5% since 2010. In fact, from 2010 to 2015, we averaged about 2.1%. And going forward in the forecast period, growth is expected to come in at a pretty weak 1.6% in 2016. In the first half of the year, it was even weaker than that. We had a really good third quarter reading that just came out at 2.9%. That's our fastest in 7 quarters, so that's a positive sign that we've seen. But in the first half of the year, we really had some weakness. If you look at consumer spending being at 3.0% in personal consumption expenditures, it really was the strength of the consumer that kept the economy from sliding further. 2017 does look like a positive outlook. We should see about 2.2% GDP growth, and then it's going to slide down a little bit from there. Esther George is the president of the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. Yesterday, she voted against keeping keeping our federal interest rates where they are. She wants to have the interest rates rise again. She's been in that camp since midsummer. And one of the things that she said when they asked her, she wrote about this in her August report, was said that, at 5% unemployment rate, we're pretty much at full employment across the United States. And she thinks that 2% is pretty much our long-run growth potential for GDP. If you look at this average on the red bars, that comes out to a 1.95 average is what's being forecast. So we're really close to what that 2% long-run growth potential is. So I do think that we will see some tightening in our monetary policy coming up. But to look at the U.S. a little bit more specifically, if we look at the employment picture has been very positive. We've seen over 6 consecutive years of employment growth now with today's release. Monetary policy has been very accommodative. What that means is interest rates have been kept low for an abnormally long period of time, and that has helped to stimulate economic growth. I think some of those headlines we saw earlier were disappointing because they thought we would see more growth due to all that stimulative monetary policy, but that wasn't necessarily the case. We did see the first phase of tightening by the Federal Reserve that happened last December, almost a year ago, and I think we're going to see another interest rate hike coming up in December. The Fed pretty much telegraphed that. But if we looked at what they said last December, they were saying they expected 4 interest rate hikes to occur this year. We haven't seen one yet. We're going to have that first one happening next month, and now they're only looking at about 2 that are going to occur in 2017 is what they're telegraphing to us, which will put the federal funds rate at just about 1%, which is still at a very historically low place, which should help to continue to stimulate economic growth. Low oil and natural gas prices have led to a precipitous decline in mining employment and capital expenditures by oil and gas firms, and that's really pulled down a lot of our GDP. This has really hurt energy-producing states. In fact, if you look at the first quarter gross domestic product by state, a lot of energy-producing states have seen that go negative. That includes our neighbor to the north, Wyoming, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Alaska, for example, are all ones that have seen negative GDP growth in the first quarter of 2016. But really, it's helped a lot of the average consumers, if you look at it, who spend a lot of their money on gas and heating bills. So if you look back in 2015 and look at what were the fastest growing states, well, it was gas-guzzling California that was one of the fastest growing at 4.1%. Oregon, just north of them, also grew by 4.1%. Texas was 3.8%. And Colorado came in at 3.6, I believe, there. So we were in the top 4 fastest growing states in terms of our GDP last year. If we look at where we were in the first quarter of this year, we're still in the top 4. Arkansas was up there. Washington was also up there, and Oregon as well, and then Colorado, we were at 3.0. So it's interesting to me that 3 of the 4 fastest growing states GDP-wise have legal marijuana. Whether that's a coincidence or a correlation, you might have to wait until this afternoon to hear from some of our speakers, and then you'll have a little bit better feel for that as well. The stronger dollar and weak global demand has hurt our manufacturers. In 2015, we added about 30,000 manufacturing jobs overall across the United States. But in 2016, manufacturing's been down. It is down about 50,000 or so on an over-the-year basis with today's employment report. And so that's really something that's been hurting, because as the dollar is stronger, it makes our goods more expensive to people abroad and really kind of drives down a little bit of that demand. And I was working on this presentation in October when the price of a barrel of energy or of oil was up over $50 and seeming to rise. So I say, inflation's returning as energy prices rise. I was just talking to Brian Lewandowski this morning, and I said, yeah, I'm kind of troubled about this, that oil's back down below 45. He said, really? And I said, yeah, the last week's been pretty miserable for it. It's been down about 12%. So from above 50 down below 44. So I do still think that energy prices are going to lead to a little bit of inflation. We only need to go back to, January, February, and we had oil below $30 a barrel again. So we've seen a significant increase from there, and I think it's going to continue to rise going forward as we're going to have increased demand and global growth as well. So this is what our payroll growth has looked like. It's really been a spectacular run of job growth across the United States. During our last expansion, we only had 53 consecutive months of growth. With today's jobs numbers, the BLS reported we added 161,000 jobs over the month. That brings us up to 73 consecutive months without a drop in employment. Now, we came pretty close in May. May was a little bit troubling overall there. And this chart breaks down our growth into both the goods-producing sectors, which are mostly our agriculture, our mining, our manufacturing and construction. Those are shown by the red bars on the bottom, and then our service providing, which are the blue bars on top. It also has a yellow line on there, which shows our annual average. If we go back to 2013, the United States added about 193,000 jobs per month on average. 2014 was just spectacular growth. We were up at about 250,000 jobs a month that we were adding. In 2015, that average fell down a little bit, about just under 230,000. We can see that. And one of the reasons why it fell was those red bars. You can see they were always positive and contributing to the growth throughout most of 2013, all of 2014. But by the time we get to 2015, they start to detract from growth a little bit. And that's mostly those mining jobs that we lost, the manufacturers that are being hurt from that stronger dollar, and a little bit of weakness in, or a little bit of relative weakness in construction as well. So now the yellow line that shows our average annual growth rate for 2016, we're averaging about 181,000 jobs per month. So that's about a 50,000 decline from where we were a year ago. And if you're wondering, well, gosh, why was the Fed saying they were going to raise rates 4 times last December, but now they're only looking at 1 this year? Well, if you look, we're adding about 50,000 less jobs per month. In October, they had a great report, October of 15, where we added nearly 300,000 jobs. They said, yes, we're on the right track. They don't quite have that exuberance, especially with May, as you see here. We only added 24,000 jobs at that point in time. We also had events in China that happened in the early part of the year that really kind of rattled the global economy. And then in the summertime, we had Brexit that happened as well. So there were a number of things that were outside of the United States that happened that kind of rattled the confidence to raise interest rates and rattled the kind of confidence in our overall economy. That being said, I do think we are in good shape going forward, save for a few industries. And one of those industries is mining. Now, hopefully, mining is nearing a bottom. This data shows the change in mining jobs from the peak that we had in September of 14, when we had over 850,000 people working in mining, through September of 13, when we're down 220,000 jobs at just over 632,000. If I had updated the number to today's number, it would be under 630. Mining dropped another 2.4%. So this overall drop was 26% of our mining jobs that we've lost in 2 years, but it's even been more extreme in our coal mining. Coal mining shown on the red line and on the right-hand axis on this chart. If we go back to the beginning of January 2012, we had nearly 90,000 coal miners in our coal mining jobs in the United States. That made up more than 1 out of every 10 energy jobs that we have. Flash forward to where we are now in 2016, and we're down over 40%. We've lost over 36,000 coal mining jobs. And so it's just been very hard in a lot of our coal communities. I'll share with you that a little bit later, but I just want you to know it's not specific to Colorado. It's happened. Southern Illinois happened in West Virginia as well, too. So coal mining is really a part of mining that's really been even more depressed economically than what our oil and gas friends have seen there as well. Now, inflation has been something that is rising. So even though the price of oil has fallen, gone down a little bit in the past week, we are seeing inflation rising. In fact, if we look at 2015, inflation was negligible across the United States. It barely registered at about a tenth. Colorado was a full percentage point higher than that at about 1.2%. And if you see the blue line, the Denver Boulder Greeley CPI, which is our proxy for inflation in Colorado, that was up 3% in the first half of 16 versus only 1.1% for the nation. And one of the reasons for why this is happening is the higher cost of shelter that we have here in the state. If you look at the rising rents or home prices, all you got to do is pick up a paper anytime you see that's always making headlines. That's really hurting people in terms of inflation and translating through and saying things are costing more here, and that's really because it's costing you a lot more to rent an apartment or to buy a home there as well. Now, one thing that I find interesting on this chart, if you look at it, is where those red and blue lines last intersect. That was back at the beginning of 2012, and that just happens to be right at 2.0%. 2.0% is the Fed's target or ceiling, you might say, for inflation. That's where they'd like to see a healthy rate of inflation in the economy. And we've been running well below that on the red line nationally for over 4 years now. So it's moving up a little bit, maybe not as fast as the Fed would hope there, and that's going to be perhaps a concern with if it does rise too fast, that they do have to tighten a little bit, and that could cause us to hit the brakes a little bit more in our economic growth. Now, moving to Colorado, we are losing a little bit of momentum, as I mentioned earlier, with 14 just being great, 15 really being good, and 16 being a little bit weaker. Now, if you look at this side, you say, well, gosh, I don't see any loss of momentum at all. What this does is take the employment level of Colorado on January of 2008 and the employment level of the United States and shows the U.S. in blue and Colorado in red. During the recession, we lost just about the same amount of jobs. We were both down about 7%. But since January 2010, Colorado's just been on a tear in terms of the jobs that we've been adding. And the U.S. has just been on kind of a steady, gradual upward trend. So from January 2008, Colorado now has 11.4% more jobs or more people working here than we did at the beginning of the recession, whereas the United States employment is up less than 5%, only 4.6%. So we've really outperformed the nation, and I think we're going to continue to outperform the nation going forward as well, but we're going to start performing a little bit slower and coming down with our growth rates a little bit closer to that of the nation as well. And now these are some numbers that are provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Joe Winter from Labor Market Information works on these, and you can really see how much better we've done than the nation. This takes pretty much the data that we saw in the last slide and breaks it down to over-the-year growth rates that we've experienced, Colorado in blue, the U.S. in red. 2011, we were about a half a percentage point faster. By the time we got to 12, that had grown to 0.7. By 13 and 14, we were almost a percentage point and a half faster than the nation. So we were just having an incredible amount of growth. And that was one of the things that drew those 70,000 migrants here that Irv mentioned earlier, too, was just our faster growth that we were enjoying here. 15, that differential was down to 1%. In 2016, it still appears as if it's 1%, but that uses the numbers as they're published through September. And actually, Joe put out a publication earlier saying that it looks like these numbers are going to be compressed and that Colorado's rate is going to be much lower, probably about 2.3%, maybe in the range of 2.5 to 2.3, somewhere there, but or maybe even lower, 2.5 to 2.0, 2.3 was just kind of a number I picked. And the nation might be a little bit slower there too, but overall, 2016, I think we're going to grow about half a percentage point faster than the nation, which is a far cry from just a couple years ago when we were a percentage point and a half faster than the nation. Now, one of the positives that we've seen is faster wage growth. In 2014, we had some of our fastest wage growth in over a decade there. We grew by 3.7%. That's shown in the red line there. However, inflation was pretty high in 2014 as well. So overall, our real gains in our paychecks was less than 1 percentage point. Now, in 2015, I had hoped that we would see continued gains from what we had in that 3.7% because the unemployment rate was running so low. Economic theory tells us when the unemployment rate's low, people are going to need to push up wages in order to entice more people to work. But that did happen. But a bigger factor that happened was we lost so many of those high-paying oil and gas jobs and other jobs that are very high-paying and replaced them with some lower-paying service jobs. So you take a guy that was making $100,000 a year working in the oil and gas industry, and then he goes into construction and making literally taking a haircut, making $40,000 or $50,000 less, and that's going to drive down the overall wages. However, the blue bar, which shows our inflation, was much lower. And so in terms of real gains at 1.6%, we saw our fastest real gains that we've seen since 2007. So that is a positive. If you feel like you have a little bit more money in your pocket, it is because those inflation's been running lower right there, lower gas prices, and you do actually. You're making more in real terms, hopefully. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Before I was talking largely about Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our in-house State Demography Office Total Estimated Job Series that we have. These are comprehensive in scope, and what we do is we take a lot of different data sources in order to get them. And the reason why we want to have this comprehensive and all-inclusive view is because we know that behind every job is a person. And we need to match up where the people are and where the jobs are, especially when we're going out with our forecast period. We got to say, okay, if we're going to have 3 million more people by 2050, where are the jobs going to be for them, and make sure we have them all in the right place. So what we do is we take wage and salary employment from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but that was only available in 2014. We take it by sector, and then we get QCW data that's provided to us by Labor Market Information, and we bring forward those wage and salary employment estimates to our current year. Then we go to the proprietors, and we pull in proprietor data from the Census non-employer statistics. Now, this is very important because this covers a lot of our consultants, a lot of people in agriculture, or just a sole proprietor, as you hear the term so often used, people who don't pay into the unemployment insurance system or who are missed by that wage and salary count there overall. And then we add in our ag workers who are working more than 150 days per year, which we get from Census of Agriculture. And then we add in those railroad workers that we have from the U.S. Railroad Retirement Board, and that gives us an estimate of our total estimated jobs. What does our total estimated jobs series look like? Well, it looks a lot like that national jobs picture that I showed you before. We saw a pretty good increase in our total estimated jobs that we enjoyed between 2003 and 2008 when we went into recession. We lost over 140,000 jobs between 2008 and 2010, but we've really been on a pretty good clip of adding jobs. In 2015, we were estimated to have 3.165 million jobs. That was an increase of about 380,000 from our low where we were in 2010, and we anticipate that this growth is going to continue. I've put our forecast up here in red. One of the things that you'll see, though, is that the slope of the line does get a little bit lower, which means we're having slower growth overall. So in 2014-15, we added over 90,000 jobs. Going forward, we think we're going to only add about 70,000 jobs, and then it's going to get a little bit slower than that as well. So I've got it broken down on this slide as well. So this shows you what the over-the-year change in jobs looks like. So 05, 06, 07, we had some pretty good job growth overall, especially relative to what it was like in the dot-com recession. And then really the bottom fell out 2009, 2010. And then we saw that gradual rise back up to our peak in 14 and 15. And now we're slowly coming back down again. So in 2016, we're estimating that we'll add just over 71,000 jobs for about a 2.3% growth rate. But then if you look at 2017 and 2018, that brings us down to about 62,000 jobs in 17 and 61,000 jobs in 18, with the growth rates at 1.9 and 1.8% respectively. But one of the things that I find fascinating and that Elizabeth has always mentioned to me since I started is that, you know, with the jobs and the net migration, they are inextricably tied together. And I didn't quite believe it until I put them together. And so I put the net migration on this chart in the red bars that we have here. Now, The net migration was a little bit more volatile early, but it's been pretty steady, and then it's been on an upward trend. But if we look at the period from 2005 to 2015, we added about 460,000 jobs, and at that same time, we had net migration of about 453,000. So that is a pretty close to one-to-one match. I now believe what she's saying. Cindy's going to show you a slide that's pretty close to that as well to this one, but it's going to be broken out into 5-year increments and really just showed you how, when we add a lot of jobs, we're bringing a lot of people in to fill those jobs. Over our forecast period, we see about 195,000 jobs that we're going to add over the next 3 years, and our estimate of net migrants that we're going to bring in to fill those is about 197,000. So they do move very close together right there, really tight relationship. Now, if you were hearing this data, you got to think, well, gosh, every part of the state's got to be doing just tremendously well based upon how well the state has been doing here relative to the nation. Unfortunately, that's not the case. This is a great thematic map that our office put out that shows how well the counties around Colorado are doing compared to their pre-recession peak. The key is a little hard to read off there, so I'll tell you what it is. If you are in a shade of red, your county has 10% less jobs than it did in 2007, 8, or 9, whenever the peak was. You'll notice that there's a strong concentration of red in our northwest portion of the state. That's where we've lost a lot of those oil and gas and mining jobs there in Moffett and Rio Blanco counties. And also in the lower Arkansas Valley in the southeast corner of the state, Region 6, where they've really been on a protracted decline in jobs and haven't seen much growth since the 90s. But one place where you do see dark green, which is where you want to be, with 5% or more jobs than you had before the recession, is up and down the Front Range. Larimer, Weld, all through Adams County was one of our fastest growing over this period, Weld County as well, and all the way down to El Paso County there too. We do see a bit of recovery that's finally happened in our central mountains with Summit, Lake, and Chaffee also above their pre-recession peaks as well. And then the lighter green also means that you are above the pre-recession peak, but only between 0 to 5% above. Of our 64 counties, only 28 of them have retained their pre-recession peak. So still a majority of our counties are below where they were before they went into the recession. The difference is a number of those counties are very sparsely populated counties. So where our population is concentrated, those counties have done pretty well. They've added a lot of jobs, and they've also continued to draw a lot of migrants in here because, as I showed earlier, the migrants are going to follow where the jobs are going. Now, this chart looks at our industries and how our industries have been performing relative to their pre-recession peak. I'm happy to say that last year when I was up here giving this presentation, there were 8 industries that were still on the negative axis here that were below their pre-recession peak. Now we're down to only 4. Given that the Great Recession was caused by the housing bubble and the financial crisis that we had, it's no surprise that construction and financial activities are 2 of the 4 industries that are still below their pre-recession peak. If you look at the red line, that's our total. We're up about 9% above where we were before we went into the recession. But any of the industries above that have just seen a tremendous amount of growth. They're growing considerably faster than what the nation or than what our state has grown by overall. One thing that I want to call out is mining was the 4th fastest growing industry above the pre-recession peak. We've lost a lot of those mining jobs. A lot of those losses weren't captured in 15, but they will be captured in 16. So I wouldn't be surprised if next year when I'm giving this presentation, mining is still barely positive above its pre-recession peak, but it's grown by less than what the total has done there overall. So this looks at our industry growth by year, comparing 2015 growth in red bars to 2014 growth, the blue bars. And one of the things that we notice here is very similar to the slide that I showed with the nation in the goods-producing industries, is that goods producing is down almost in every industry from where it was in 2014 in its growth rate. The most noticeable one is mining, where mining was up 10% in 2014 and now down 8% in 2015. Agriculture is down a little bit, as well as we're dealing with lower commodity prices. A lot of our agricultural communities there. Utilities, very small player, not very big. Construction's an interesting one there, where its growth rate in 2015 was half of where it was in 2014. And now one of the reasons why that could be is a shortage of workers. One of the things that came out just this week was the Employment Cost Index. And on that, it showed that the average wage in construction actually fell on an over-year basis. That was the first time it's ever happened since 2001. And one of the reasons why they attributed that was just a dearth of people that are experienced in the construction industry, and then bringing in very unexperienced workers at very low wages, which helps to drive down their wages. But it also makes finding people to employ more difficult, especially when we're sitting here at a 3.6% unemployment rate. But overall, our growth has been just marginally slower. We grew by 3.3% as a state using our state demography office estimates in 2014. That growth was 3.1% in 2015. One place where we do see another steep decline is in the admin and waste. That's where you find temporary help services. That's a leading indicator often, but I think more than likely is what we're seeing here is that a lot of those goods producing industries couldn't find enough full-time workers, so they were using those temp help services there. And as their kind of industries have slowed down, they have had less demand for those temporary help, and that's one of the reasons why admin and waste grew at 3.1% last year and is now at 1.7% this year, or this past year in 2015. Now, this looks very similar to the slide that I just showed you for the United States, but this uses Colorado mining employment instead. To get this, I used Bureau of Labor Statistics QCEW data that shows that in January of 2015, we peaked at about 36,000 mining jobs. I then took that QCEW data all the way through the first quarter of 2016 and then used the CES estimates after that. So you do see where it looks like the mining job losses have leveled out a little bit. I am hopeful that that is the case, but I think that when we get the second quarter release, we might see that line continue to decline there a little bit more. And Joe's sitting in the front row here shaking his head, so that leads me to believe that, we probably still haven't seen the worst yet for mining, but hopefully we're nearing a bottom for mining. One place that we've had even more of a decline is in our coal mining jobs. Back in the middle or April of 2012, we had nearly 2,500 coal miners that were employed in our state. If we flash forward to where we were in September, that number is down nearly 1,400, down to just over 1,060 coal miners. That's a protracted decline in our coal mining, over 56%. The nation was down only 40%. This has really affected a lot of our coal communities on the western slope. They've really been reeling from the loss of coal mining jobs and even closures of a number of mines that we've had as well. Oil production has been on an exponential growth rate for about 7 years up until 2015, but lower oil prices have finally caught up to it. And what we saw was a record level of production in 2015 at 127 million barrels of oil that were produced. Our estimates that we have in-house are anticipating about a 10% decline this year. Part of that is due to a lot lower level of the number of rigs that are drilling in our state. And another function is that a lot of wells are being drilled but not completed, so they're not being fracked or finished because those producers are waiting for prices to come back up. As prices rise back up above 50 and hopefully get back up above 60, we will likely see our oil production kind of rise again and go back up on that upward trend, but it might not ever grow on that same pace that it grew over those past 7 years, because we had a lot of technological innovations with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing that really allowed us to get a lot more out of every well and to drill fewer wells and get more oil out of the ground. But overall, oil has been a bright spot up until this year for our state. So employment changed since 2010. Similar coloring scheme on the good, the green. Not like Gordon Gekko, green is good, but green is good in this case. So you look again, Larimer County, Weld County. In this case, all those counties in dark green are up 15% in terms of their job growth from 2010. Now, the opposite end of that spectrum is the purple, and that's a place where you don't necessarily want to be, but we still have 15 counties in our state that are in a shade of light or dark purple. As I mentioned earlier, Moffett, Rio Blanco, Los Animas, those are all counties that have lost coal mining jobs. We've also seen some jobs that were lost in Clear Creek due to the decline in molybdenum prices as well. And then again, our lower Arkansas Valley, that southeast corner of the state, has seen a lot of decline in employment over the past 10 years when the rest of the state has just seen a tremendous amount of job growth. If we look at what has just happened over the past year, it's very similar. We still have another 15 counties that failed to add jobs in 2015 when the state overall grew by 96,000 jobs according to our job estimates. But one of the things that I do find as a positive sign here is when we look at our central mountain communities that we have here, Eagle, Lake, Chaffee, Park, a lot of those have seen pretty strong job growth of 3.5% or more. Summit was just under 5% this past year. Down in the southwest corner of the state, Archuleta was one of our fastest growing counties. That's because they added a Walmart down there, so that really helped to boost their employment growth. San Miguel, where Telluride is, really benefited from the filming of a movie down there, a Quentin Tarantino movie, brought a lot of money and jobs into there, but they are also doing quite well. Larimer County doing better than Weld County is in Region 2 up north there, and one of the reasons is Weld County has started to feel some of the fallout of those lost in oil and gas jobs that I showed earlier. A number of those mining jobs are concentrated there in Weld County. Back in 2014, Weld County was one of the two fastest growing counties in the United States at an 8% plus growth rate. In 2015, that growth rate fell down into the 2s. And if we look forward to our forecast period, 2016, we anticipate that Weld County is going to experience a slight decline, about a 1.1% decline in their jobs. So overall, 2016, I already mentioned we expect us to add about 71,000 jobs for a 2.3% growth rate. Colorado's likely at full employment. We haven't seen our unemployment rate change over the year. We're still at 3.6%, but we have seen a great increase in our labor force, so this is encouraging. We really didn't see much growth in our labor force in 2015, but 2016 we're up almost 75,000. We've seen our number of unemployed increase just slightly. We now have 104,500 unemployed in our state. But the positive news is if you look at the Help Wanted Online job series, we have 120,000 job ads. So that means we have a more demand for jobs than we do a supply of unemployed workers. If we look at this nationally, there's about 7.8 million unemployed people nationally and 4.7 million job ads right there. So that's a difference of nearly double a supply-demand rate. So our unemployment rate, as long as it's lower than the nation, is going to continue to bode well for continued immigration, as Cindy will share with you. This takes LMI data, looks at where the job demand changes have been across the board. We've seen a decline in the number of job postings that we've seen. Registered nurses remains the top advertised position. The one that has moved up in the list as number 2 that wasn't there last time is a heavy and tractor trailer and truck drivers. That could be because of aging of that group. It could be because of drug testing and difficulty getting people that can work in that occupation. And then the other place that we've seen upward movement is in our first line supervisors of food prep and servers. And that is a reflection of the tremendous amount of growth that we've seen in the accommodation and food services sector. So now to our employment forecast. I just have a couple slides left overall. But the way we compute our employment forecast is we look at our base industries. And our base industries are the ones that are listed up there. And these are ones that bring outside dollars into our community there. So if it's mining, it's oil or coal that's getting shipped out there. Professional and business services, people that are contracting out engineering services, computer systems design in our state. Tourism is a really big component for our state. We look at not only that accommodations and food, but second homes, transportation to them, the retail that people who come here bring in as well. And then household jobs come from retiree generated, from the Social Security checks, federal transfers, investment income and wealth, and then commuting jobs, people who might live in Weld County but drive down to Denver to work and then bring those dollars they earn in Denver back to Weld County to spend. Combined with our local resident service jobs, those dollars that those commuters are spending in their restaurants and at retail establishments, we come up with our total estimated job series, and that's what we're looking forward to going forward, is looking at our economic forecast. So what are our forecast trends have? Well, we're going to see slower growth through 2020. It's going to pick up a little bit in 2021 as the U.S. growth rate slows and our number of leavers or retirees increases. We're going to see continued slowing in our goods-producing traditional basic. We're going to see really good growth in our investment, or in our household jobs. Retiree-generated jobs are going to grow by 5.2% over the next 5 years and over 3% over our forecast period. Investment in income wealth, that unearned income, dividends, and rent are going to continue to drive jobs. And commuting, although not really a net driver of jobs in our state, is really big in a number of counties, such as Teller County, Park County, Garfield County, and the aforementioned Weld County. The Front Range is going to continue to be a driver of our employment growth due to its diversified economic base. And local resident service jobs are going to expand to meet the needs of a growing population. We anticipate those to grow by about 1.4% over the forecast period, which is almost identical to our population growth. Cindy's going to show you a slide that's going to be very similar to this one going forward, but it just shows you how well Colorado's performed relative to the nation. Colorado are the green bars, and the nation is the orange line here. And this is the over-the-year growth rate, looking back 25 years, which we've actually realized, and then looking forward 25 years. One thing that we see in a recession, we pretty much decline in lockstep with the nation, but when we are growing in expansion, Colorado grows faster than what the nation does. We anticipate this trend to continue throughout the next 25 years of our forecast period, but we expect the growth to be a little bit slower overall, going down to under 1% in 2020, and then picking up a little bit after that with the overall growth rate for us annualized over this period at about 1.4%. So the reason, again, why I mentioned we're going to have slower growth is because we have a lot of change in our organic kind of growth of our labor force. This slide looks at the difference between the number of 16-year-olds who are entering the labor force and 65-year-olds who are exiting. In the 1990s, we had 25,000 on average growth in our labor force organically from people who were here in state. In the 2000s, that was up above 30,000. Recently, we've fallen down considerably, and you look at that precipitous drop-off that's happened since 2010, that's due to those baby boomers. We're having a lot more people turning 65 in our state than we are having relative to the number who are turning 16. And so going forward, we're only going to need to add about 13,000 jobs in order to absorb those organic growth in our labor force. Before it was 30,000, so we needed to have that really strong growth in the 1990s and first part of 2000 in order to absorb those people. But now we're not going to have as much organic growth, so generally our growth is going to be slower. And this just isn't particular to Colorado. This is happening across the nation as well, which is one of the reasons why you saw in that last slide the orange bars are getting progressively lower and slower as well. So our forecast, looking across the state here again, one of the positives we see, Elbert County is going to be our fastest growing county over this period here, but we see a lot of growth resuming in our Central Mountain resort communities. That includes some of those ones that are down in the southwest quarter of the state there, San Miguel, San Juan, Archuleta. We see continued slow growth on our eastern plains. We have 11 counties that are going to see declines over this period, similar to what we've seen recently, where we still had 15 counties that were declining last year. And we're going to see pretty strong growth in the Denver metro area. Our annualized growth overall for the state in this period is 1.7%. Denver metro and Larimer and Weld are going to be a little bit above this rate of growth overall too. But our resource-dependent communities and our agriculture communities are all slower growing as well. Looking over the next 20 years, looking out, we're going to see considerably slower growth. Our annualized growth rate is just under 1.3%, and if you look those counties in orange that are growing faster than 2% annualized, there's only 2 of them. Elbert, we're expecting to grow at about a 3% annualized rate, and Weld just over 2%. But other than that, everyone's right in that 1.5 range, or 1.5 to 2 range, or even less. We do see that the Denver metro area is going to be growing by slower than what we're going to see in Eagle and Garfield. Brian's going to share with you a little bit later that, Eagle and Garfield are two of the places that have larger population bases, same as Montrose. That's one of the things that helps with their resiliency, and it just helps with their growth. When you have a certain population density and population base, that's going to help drive your employment growth going forward as well. So that is what I have for you today. I have a chance to take a couple questions from you too, if you'd like. We ask that you go to the microphones. There's a couple set up on either side of the room here. That way everyone who is following along on the live stream will be able to hear as well. And if you don't have any questions, or if I don't have time to take it, my email address and phone number are both up there. It's always a welcome break from a spreadsheet to get a call there. So feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if you have any questions. All right, we got Greg coming up with a question.
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Oh, we'll get that turned on here.
No? Yes?
There you go.
Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. The very last slide that you showed, you had projected job growth from 2020 to 2040, annualized by county. A lot of those trends make intuitive sense to me. One that jumped out that I hadn't considered was the bullish growth projections that your office has for Montrose County. I don't know how equipped you are to speak on specific county projections individually, but I wanted to ask about that one.
You know, Montrose County that's a great question right there. And we think it's really well situated where it is there, just a little bit south of Mesa County. So they're going to be able to grow by providing commuters into Mesa County. And it's also really a good regional hub there as well. If you're going to Telluride or going to a lot of the places in the southwest corner of the state, there's good plane flights that are going into Montrose County. And there's also a lot of retail there. In fact, I always laugh whenever I go through Montrose. There are 2 city markets in Montrose, one on the north end of town, one on the south end of town. So that kind of shows you the differences in how they serve the population right there too. So, it's interesting. A lot of the Western Slope, if we looked at the recovery from the recession, has not quite recovered yet, but we are still seeing that that's one of the faster growing places that we've seen over the past 25 years. It's a beautiful place to live. It's relatively inexpensive relative to some of the median home prices that we've seen recently in Denver. And we do think that retirees will help to drive that as well when they want to go to a place that's not as congested, but still beautiful and has access to good health care and good amenities too.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I just have a quick question. With the rise in technology such as telework, do you think that will impact our state economically?
I do. I think it will definitely. And I think that one of the things that has kind of hampered telework in a number of our outlying communities has been access to broadband. And as we're seeing the state and the FCC put out incredible initiatives to roll out broadband to a lot of our outlying counties. San Juan County is one that stands out here. They just got 100 megabyte fiber that's going into there. So I think that's going to help them to grow. San Juan's a beautiful place down there in Silverton, but if you have to use dial-up, you really can't telework from down there. But now that they have fiber in there, I think that will help. So I think that was really kind of the missing link, was part of the broadband and the connectivity there. But now that we are having improved broadband access and infrastructure throughout most of the state, we really do think that will help, and that does show up in a lot of our commuting numbers. You might not have to drive to Denver for the job, but you VPN in, and you're same as working in an office there. It's just a remote office. So that is a great question. I do think that has a tremendous amount of potential. It is a beautiful state to live where we live, and many of beautiful counties that are less populated than where we have in the Front Range. So if you can live there, bring your job there with you, I think that a lot of people will do that for sure. Allison.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting, Chris. I really appreciate it. I had a question about the growth comparison graph that you had, and it showed education with huge growth. It showed government with growth. And then it showed the negative side for growth for construction and real estate. So I was hoping you could explain that a little bit more detailed.
Definitely. And the education and education is mostly private education, and government, the local government component of that would have the education in there as well. And part of that was driven by these millennials that we have, where they weren't all necessarily in school before the recession there, but then you flash forward 8 years later and you have a number of them all in school going through college now and the like too. So that has helped to drive the demand, just the sheer number of them that had worked through the system and the education system, private ed there as well. And then I think the construction really, we were in a bubble. We overbuilt. I think we had some exuberance in construction. So part of that was, and this is something that affected a lot of those Western Slope communities too, is they had such a strong tie and concentration in construction that when the bubble burst and they lost those jobs, a lot of those construction workers have moved out of our state or moved on to different industries, and they didn't necessarily come back. And so I think that is one thing that construction is facing right now, is just a lack of qualified workers, or having some difficulty to fill those positions. So construction could have probably, it's hopefully next year we'll be back on the positive side there again, but it's kind of over frothy where it was, to say, kindly, where the bubble was with the amount of construction employment that we had prior to the recession. And then it's taken a long time to work through some of those scars there and get back. Same thing with real estate. I think that, it did take a while to kind of work through some of that excess that we've had in the real estate markets, but that seems to have been solved. We do seem to be in a very tight real estate market. That also includes rental and leasing in that real estate component, so it's not all exactly real estate, but I think both construction and real estate should be on upward trends going forward here. You're welcome. Yes.
Say, Chris, regarding the estimates method for population and job growth, does the demographer's office consider the carrying capacity of our near crisis in workforce housing related to workforce housing affordability and availability? And then the second part of that would be regarding the finite resources in water resources related to these population estimates. Is that part of the methodology in making the estimates?
Those are wonderful questions, and anyone who's been in Colorado for any period of time knows that water is something that's very critical right there. I think there was a book that I read one time that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting for, and that sums it up pretty much. And we are seeing that, and that there is a lot of struggle between the places where the water is on the Western Slope and the places where the population is here, with where the water doesn't necessarily fall as much. And housing is also a great constraint. We have a number of areas in our state that have very low housing prices. If we look down in the lower Arkansas Valley, but they're not necessarily drawing population there because that's not necessarily where the jobs are. So to answer your question, we don't explicitly have it as part of our model, but it is intrinsically in the model there as constraints that we see, because we know that if housing prices are too much, or if a manufacturing company needs a lot of water and they can't access it, they won't choose to locate their jobs here, or they won't choose to locate here if housing prices are too expensive for their employees to afford. And so then we won't have those jobs built in, and then therefore we won't have the people coming in to fill the jobs either. So it's a question we get quite frequently, and it's something we're very cognizant of, but it's nothing that we say, okay, how many acre feet of water do we have for this certain area and how much can it grow? There are water planners and transportation planners that are out there that have even a much further horizon than what we do. We greatly appreciate them. They're some of our favorite people to work with on their 100-year horizon, and those are the people that really work that into their models a lot more. Ours is a very complex model as it is, and we don't necessarily have adjustments for it, but I do think we are very aware of some of those limitations in the constraints with housing prices and water that we face through our state. So I have about a minute left. If we have one more question, I could take that. Yes.
It's election season, and we're hearing a lot on television and through media about the different policies that the candidates have. Are there any policies, looking at this map that you have here, that would change or affect any of this in our state?
There is a policy, and that's I'm not going to speak to the national election because that's kind of above where I am. But when we look at what Governor Hickenlooper has done in his second term with his Blueprint 2.0, he's really had a strong focus on our rural communities. And if we look, it's a lot of the rural communities that seem to feel like they've been left behind. So between our push to get broadband out to those areas, to get them connected, to work with OEDIT and look at these different initiatives that they can do to help diversify their economic bases. I think that's a problem that a lot of these rural communities face is they have strong concentrations in either tourism or agriculture and not a very diverse economic base. But as the state is working with these communities to help diversify their base, be able to attract Lone Eagles and other location neutral businesses, that will help all those counties. It's a slow process. Economic development is a process that is best done over decades rather than years. So it's going to go over a number of different terms there as well. So, there's a lot that's being done at the state level. A lot of it's being done behind the scenes. It's tough to see that, but I'm really hopeful that going forward and that when we look at this forecast period, that a lot of the work that's being done now is going to be laying the groundwork for job growth in 2025 and beyond.